James Hewes. Welcome to Around the Bloc. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
You know, it'd be worth sharing with the audience. One of the first times we met was in a cafe in Paris a couple of years ago when I came basically begging for advice and assistance. And coming full circle, I'm now inviting you on the podcast. It feels good.
Yeah, that's right. It was one of those great kind of LinkedIn meetings, wasn't it? Where I think you'd reached out and I happened to be in Paris, and so we met in person. And I was just excited to hear what all about the writer's block and the great work that you were doing, and we've stayed in touch ever since. I was really glad to come on the podcast and talk a bit more.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, cool. It's great to have you. So I guess we can kind of jump straight into it. Some of the, there's a lot of hot topics in media and publishing and journalism around at the moment. And, depending on where you start, it could be a minefield. But one of the things I found really interesting was you put up a post reacting, I think it was on LinkedIn, to Jeff Bezos's sort of announcement about the Washington Post and him now taking the opinion editorial direction in, what did he call it? Free markets and freedom of speech, something like that, whatever it was. Obviously, certain people were up in arms about it. Some people defended it. And it just got me thinking, like, one of the things that we push in Writer's Block is kind of like objectivity and journalism. But you rightly pointed out that, particularly in the UK, for example, a lot of publications are partisan and they take a side a little bit, at least for the opinions and the editorial side, maybe less so with particularly, more data or fact-based stories. That, I think, is a good place to start, right? What do you think about this whole situation in general?
Well, I think the surprising thing there was not that he had done it. I mean, proprietors interfering in their newspaper's editorial line is as old as newspapers themselves. I mean, William Randolph Hearst was doing it in the early part of the 20th century, never mind the 21st century. And as you rightly say, it's been a feature of British newspapers almost forever. So I don't think that's the surprising aspect of it. Is that it's perhaps a little more unusual in the US market, but not that unusual either. I think the surprise was more the signal of intent in terms of the dramatic repositioning of the Post from its historically quite liberal background into something a lot more aligned with, let's say, the kind of Donald Trump world or the Republican world, which is not traditionally the comfortable home of either the newspaper or its readers. And there was a little bit of me that thought, well, perhaps this is just a cynical exercise in sucking up to the administration. But then I thought, well, there might also be a sense here that Bezos has looked at the market and realized that there isn't a newspaper that fills that space. And that with his marketing hat on, and if nothing else, he's very good at that, he may be thinking that there's an opportunity in the long term to reposition the Post in opposition almost to the New York Times and carve out a very specialist space or a different space, a different niche in the market, and grow the newspaper. And kind of overlaid on that is that for the last 5 years, they've been fighting a circulation war with the New York Times and losing, particularly in digital subscriptions. So he may now have got to the conclusion that it's not possible to beat the New York Times as the number one paper of record, and certainly not in its traditional space.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. And I do, it makes me recall, for example, back at there was a conference we were both at in September when there was the revenue conference, and there was a chap on stage from the New York Times talking about essentially their, in broad strokes, but their strategy for the coming years and what they were trying to focus on. And, one thing that I noted was that there was no mention of journalism, right? There was ads and classifieds and games and, lots of this stuff, which is great for, monetization. But it does seem to sort of more align itself with the mass market entertainment segment rather than sort of journalism. And so, maybe he's taking his own side, whichever side of the fence he seems to be taking. At least Bezos then seem to be favoring journalism versus, out and out entertainment. Would that be a fair comment, or?
And he was limiting his direction to the opinion pages, where they are what they say on the tin. They are an opinion, in this case, of the newspaper or of the feature writers that they've chosen to give that opinion. I think the consequence was that signaled a shift in the editorial direction of the newspaper overall. But you're right. I mean, I think it was a very I don't want to say a journalistically led statement, because that's slightly wrong, but he wasn't focused on new content areas. He was just giving a very clear view on what he wanted the opinions of the paper to focus on. And like I said, I don't think that's anything new for a proprietor.
Yeah, I guess maybe the only difference there historically is that maybe he did that in the background in the past. Maybe he was a bit more hidden or cached about it, and now it's just a bit more overt. And so because it's out in the open now, maybe that's causing a reaction.
And Lord knows I'm no defender of Trump and co. I mean, I think it's pretty shambolic what they're doing. But the thing that people forget is that Bezos has done this before. When Trump was elected the first time, the Washington Post very publicly adopted the slogan, democracy dies in darkness, which was seen as a rebuke to the Trump administration. So that was him interfering on the other side, if you like. So I think there's a little bit of double standards here to hold your metaphorical apron because he happens to be interfering in a way that you disagree with. I mean, Lord knows I disagree with those opinions, but on the other hand, to use that cliche, I would defend his right to have them.
In either instance, whether it was in the 2016 or following the 2016 election or the most recent one here where Trump got elected, it seems that he's just using it as a tool politically to advance his own reputation, perhaps. And again, that's not anything new either, really, is it? In terms of whether a wealthy individual owns a particular publication or if it's a state-owned publication, it's about those owners putting forward a narrative about how they think, people should think and society should view.
Murdoch has been doing it for half a century, and there's nothing new in this. I think the broader point here, the macro point here, is it just kind of throws a light on really something that we all knew, but Bezos is perhaps realizing, which is that media is hard. It's not actually as easy as disrupting the book trade or the grocery trade or all the other trades that he's disrupted over the years. Getting it right is fundamentally quite difficult, and getting the combination of the content, the journalism, and the business model right to the point where you not only make a profit but are able to grow and establish a market position is really bloody hard. He's one of the most successful businessmen in the world, love him or hate him, and even he can't do it. So, it tells us a lot about those businesses in this space that do it, and how well run they are, and how much of a specialist profession this is. This is, anybody who's listened to me speak before knows this is one of my hobby horses. I get very annoyed at people who come into the industry thinking that they can just pick it up and do it when they've been an expert in something else. It's like me coming to your house and saying I'm a plumber and I'm going to fix your sink just because I've seen a few videos of how to do plumbing. This is a specialist industry with a specialist profession with specialist skills. And Bezos, like everybody else who's tried to come into this industry, is realizing that he's actually quite difficult.
Yeah, fair. That's a really good point. It's not like, in other either product or service businesses where usually a combination of one or multiple of better, faster, cheaper drives results, right? Certainly faster and cheaper we've seen in the news cycle definitely doesn't manifest itself into A, profits, first of all, but then B, sustainability, because people, they get sick of the doom news loop and they bail out, or they get sick of just, weak stories, right? So that's a really interesting point then. So if he's chosen to focus on journalism, let's just call it that for argument's sake, right? Take it at the surface level. That presumably is a similar stance for a lot of other publications, whether they're an independent publication or whether they're a larger publication. So when you compare that to the New York Times, it's quite, well, I don't want to say easy again, because it's not easy, but it's quite clear to see how you can generate revenue from things like ads or classifieds or some of those more, as I said, entertainment aligned activities that they're doing. So how does a publication, Washington Post or otherwise anyone, become profitable and build a sustainable business model around actual journalism?
Well, to use the old joke, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be a consultant. I'd be owning a media business. No, I think it is a magic formula that only certain people have got right. I mean, there's a number of different ways to answer that question. The taking a step back view would be to say that in most markets, not everybody is going to succeed. There are still a large number of brands that are going to fail because the markets are overcrowded in some spaces, and there needs to be fewer publishing businesses, quite frankly. That's just a fact of life. But the ones that do survive, I think, are the ones that have a combination of two things, that have a very clear position in the market. Almost the more niche, the better. It seems to be the emerging success factor. But those that do are then very agnostic about how they get their revenue from that audience. So they don't think of themselves necessarily as newspapers or even as media businesses. They think of themselves as audience businesses, and they say, I will go where my audience goes, and I will monetize my audience in whatever way they choose. They choose, not I choose. So, if I'm running I've got in front of me on the desk here a watch. If I'm running a watch magazine, then I might also have a watch fair, but I might also be a retailer of secondhand watches. This is, something that Hodinkee has done very well in recent years. They've gone from being a specialist website about watches to being now a broad spectrum publisher with events and magazines, but also a retailer. And they go where the enthusiasts want them to go. So I think that's if you get all of those factors right, then you've got a good chance of succeeding. The ones that won't succeed are the ones that are not sufficiently differentiated and or are reliant too heavily on one usually traditional, usually advertising business model. We've entered a period of relative calm, I'd say, in the media world at the moment. It's kind of almost surprising calm before the storm after a number of years of disruption. But I think this is just the calm before the next storm, where you will see a load of other businesses go to the wall as a result of the combination of AI, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, and the failure to adopt a kind of multifaceted revenue strategy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like audience understanding, or really sort of knowing why your audience exists and comes to your site or to your publication in the first place at all is really important, because then you can start to understand maybe what are the behaviors and activities they do before they read some of your content and what they do after. And then that's how you can sort of structure new ways to deliver value for them, which you can then sort of monetize and gain revenue from.
Yeah, that's right. And the need that's being serviced is not the need to provide them with a magazine or a website or a good article or a photograph or whatever. It's the need to service their community and their passion, and to feel part of their community. And so you're going where their community goes, and you're serving that passion in whatever form it is, because they don't think of themselves as a reader. They think of themselves as a watch enthusiast, and they just want to interact with other watch enthusiasts and with the watch enthusiast world, to use that example. So, and I think for a long time, and the industry's getting better at this. For a long time, we thought, oh, well, we're publishers, and so we publish, and that's what we do. I think now the businesses that are starting to succeed are the ones that go, we serve enthusiasts and we serve them wherever they go, and we don't really care we're kind of agnostic as to what the platform is, which in the 25 years ago would have been considered unacceptably risky, and it's not the kind of thing we do. But now it's the hygiene factor that you have to win.
You've nailed it with the watch example, and I think another similar example, which takes a lot of flack but has a very clear correlation there, I think, is like the fitness influencer type of industry on, say, like YouTube or anywhere else, is, because those guys, especially the top, let's say the most successful influencers and creators in that space, right? They're creating content around fitness, whether it's like the nutrition element or going to the gym or diet or behaviors or whatever it might be. But then, exactly as you say, because they're community and they're facilitating people who feel to themselves are, oh, I'm a fitness person, or I'm a nutrition person, or this or that, they're able to sell products, and they're able to sell not just physical products, but maybe information products. They can sell services, they can put on events, they can, exactly as you say, like foster that community. And what does a community does? All of those things and more, right?
Yeah, that's right. And a well-run influencer business, a well-run influencer individual is akin to a media business in the way that they operate, probably with the exception that they're not they're not objective in the way that a media business or a journalistic business would hope to be, and that's usually the differentiation. They don't make that differentiation obvious to the audience, but then there's an argument to say the audience doesn't really care. And I'm including only here the kind of well-run professional influencer businesses, which probably only accounts for about the top 1%. The other 99% of that world is a kind of murky, slightly garbage dumpy world of nonsense. But that's not to disparage the ones that do it really, really well. And the ones that do it really, really well are the ones that are focusing on becoming a proper business. And so they follow. People may think it's something completely different. It's actually not different. It's just an individual-led rather than a corporate-led business.
Yeah, it seems that maybe it's perhaps the frame that it's looked through is different, but other than that, it seems the output and the activities are rather similar.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, John, and there's only ever two ways to make money from people. You either make it money directly, in other words, they pay you for something, or you make it indirectly. Somebody else pays you in the hope that your audience will pay them for something. So, and influencers follow the same model, right? And the good ones, as you say, in fitness, can sell fitness programs directly to their fans, or can sell fitness classes directly, whatever it might be. So they're getting some kind of direct revenue from their fans, but they can also sell fitness clothing and food and protein supplements and all this kind of stuff indirectly on an affiliate basis with a commercial partner, which is just indirect monetization. These are not revolutionary business models. What's revolutionary is focusing them around an individual, although you could argue even that's not that revolutionary. What is revolutionary is the fact that you don't need to be on TV to have achieved this, that you have now your own means of distribution. That's the bit that's revolution, the distribution method.
Yeah, the word you used earlier was niche, right? And you can basically find and then be able to cater to these niches and even micro niches just through the internet, right? Like, I mean, it's incredibly easy nowadays. So, and fitness was just an example I was thinking of because it was easy. Another one is like new mothers, right? That's a big one I see online. Is there's so much content around that, and exactly as you say, you can sell information, you can sell products, you can sell events, you can sell clothing, you can sell all sorts of stuff. And that's not to say that you're then just becoming a shop or whatever. It's I really like the phrase you used there. It's just sort of create that community, establish that community.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like that's probably. Well, that's certainly where independent media is going broadly. So to bring it all back for publishers, right? Like, what could a publisher learn from any of that? Because that can be kind of a daunting thing, right? Especially if you've come from maybe a more traditional, let's say you spent the last 10 or 15 years in traditional publishing with those traditional models. It's all been upended now, but you are still left at the helm of a publication here. So that can be kind of daunting, right? And, within your experience, because you've had a breadth of experience now from, say, running FIPP, but also now with your consulting, and then just basically having visibility and access to all these different contexts. What would you say that a publisher could learn from all of that?
I think, I would divide the publishing market broadly into three sectors. I'd say that, and this is consumer publishing, B2B slightly different. In the consumer world, you've got luxury, you've got mass, and you've got niche. To take the middle one of those first, mass, I think if you're a mass market publisher, you really don't have much of a long-term future because the mass is being catered for by the internet. It's extremely difficult to monetize because that's being occupied by largely free information. The advertising-only model for digital doesn't really work. And we're seeing this with, brands in the middle of the market like the Daily Mirror in the UK, the newspaper, which is essentially a mass market newspaper. The only monetization model they've got is to flog newspapers and flog ads on the website, and neither of those works very well. So I think that's a difficult sector to be in. Luxury, I think, is more protected in the sense that luxury advertisers will still migrate towards trusted legacy media formats like magazines and even, television, whatever it might be. So you still have to follow the same approach. You still have to have that kind of following the passion and following the audience, but you're a little bit more insulated from the speed of change. But I think it's in niche where publishers should really take note. And I would guess the message would be focus only on those niches where you can have the entirety of the audience relationship. Be prepared to get out of those niches where you can't. be
What does that
prepared.
mean? Sorry to interject there. What does that mean, the entirety of the audience relationship?
Well, I always use the example of dear old Simon Weir, who was at Future, who left to set up Shift Active Media, which was a cycling business, and that focused on every aspect of a cyclist's need. So he wasn't just producing cycling magazines and cycling videos; he was acting as the PR guy, as a PR agency for cycling component suppliers, or he was being a video producer for the Tour de France, or whatever it might be. So he was again prepared to be completely platform agnostic, to own the domain of cycling, and it became an extremely wealthy business. So, but him having done that means that nobody else can do it. So if you can't own that niche, then don't be in it in the first place. I think that's the first lesson. The second lesson is to be platform agnostic, to not say to yourself that we are a magazine producer or a retailer or whatever it happens to be, just to say that we serve enthusiasts, we serve our enthusiast community, and go where that takes you, which has consequences for risk and all that kind of stuff. I think the third one, and the most controversial one, and the one I've been saying for a while, is get used to being smaller. There's no harm in being smaller, more focused, more profitable. There's too many large businesses still trying to. There is no economy of scale in publishing anymore. Pretty much, it was an enormous economy of scale when we were all printing magazines, because a lot of the production process benefited from being scale. If you accept that the digital ad model is basically broken, which was the only other thing that required scale, the rest you can probably achieve without the scale of a traditional business, and you're probably better off for it. So I think get used to being deeper, narrower and smaller, but that's probably more profitable than where you are right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like there's a one of these aphorisms I always hear is like the riches are in the niches, as they say, and like it makes sense that a lot of people, I mean, I even think of things that I'm, your own hobbies or interests, right? The stuff that you'll be willing to spend more than the average person who consumes that type of stuff, versus stuff that other people will spend a bomb on and you couldn't care less.
Well,
right?
it's a characteristic of each consumer, and to go back to our watch example, a very, very enthusiastic niche watch consumer will spend £10,000 on a watch without thinking about it. And so you want that consumer in your world. I mean, I use always the example of, Jens Muffelman gave this example around marlin fishing, where they were publishing a marlin fishing magazine and getting $20 a month out of marlin fishermen, and realized that all the money was in the tournaments. So they bought the tournaments. And so instead of them spending $20, they were spending thousands of dollars. And as an added bonus, they now had data on all these billionaire guys who go marlin fishing and can afford to spend $100,000 going marlin fishing. So, it generated more than just the obvious return.
Yeah, so it sounds like they just shifted the frame of value, really, and the magazine, the publication became not a revenue, still core to the community, but not a revenue driver for the business.
Not the biggest revenue driver. The biggest revenue driver is to capture the data and own the audience, and then you can do what you like with it, right? Then, if you've got a good data team, a good insight team, you will know what the habits and activities and touch points of that community are, and you can focus on serving them, whether that's yourself or through an affiliate relationship. Really, the hurdle is whether or not that intersection of scale of audience and profitability is viable for you as a business. So if we carry on with our watch analogy, it's probably too niche to only focus on swatch collectors. I mean, there are quite a few swatch collectors in the world, but they're probably not valuable enough as a niche in and of themselves to serve them uniquely, although I'm sure there are people who do. You want to basically focus on the people who are able to spend £10,000 on a watch, which is a very small self-selecting group, but is very valuable. So you've got to find that sweet spot, and it'll be different in every market. If you're talking about sport fishermen, in the UK, big tradition here of people going fishing, sitting by a lake and catching trout or whatever it happens to be. I mean, that's an enormous community. I think somebody said it's the biggest leisure activity in Britain or something like that. I mean, it's enormous numbers. So that's a niche, and it's not too big a niche because it shares a common passion and a common set of requirements and values, and that's probably the determining factor. Is if you can find an audience that has commonality, a high degree of commonality, then you can serve them.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking there, it made me think of the recent Jaguar example where they did their rebrand. Now, I know it's not publishing, but it's exactly as you say. They just decided, right, we're changing our audience to, I think they openly said that we're expecting to lose 85% of our audience because we're now focusing much higher up the food chain and targeting a much less price sensitive and sort of more affluent clientele. So there's probably something to be learned now. Again, that ruffled a few feathers, particularly in Britain and the old boys who love their Jags and all that sort of stuff. But I guess there's something, just based on what you said there, it sounds like there's something that almost to be learned from that for publishers, not necessarily to upend all of your customers or to get rid of 85% of your base, but to actually just determine, like, well, what is the niche that we want to serve? Who sort of has the buying power within that, and think about it critically. How big or small, narrow rather, do we have to go to be able to actually, deliver value, but also generate revenue? Then on the other hand,
yeah, that's right. And there are brands that do it very well in this country. I mean, BBC History magazine, a good example of where they are genuinely trying to go where their audience goes, whether that's in history trips and, providing specialist speakers for cruises and podcasts, as well as the traditional stuff of making a magazine and a website. So, it's not an unknown phenomenon in this country. But I think it's the thing about throwing your audience out the window, you only do that if you genuinely see an opportunity to make more money and you're prepared to take the risk of ending up with nothing. And that's not the case, and nor should it be the case for a large number of businesses. Easy to forget that for a lot of people, print is still enormously profitable. Magazines are still enormously profitable. You would be silly to throw away a very profitable business. So you don't want to be too radical with some of these things, but you do want to have that as your guiding strategy and be prepared to reinvest the profits that you're making from those print and increasingly from those digital businesses into other things, and not be afraid of that.
You might know better than me, but wasn't it Car World who reduced their frequency of public print publication from 12 issues monthly to quarterly, and then 4x the price as well, from something like around a tenner, maybe just less than a tenner, to I think like £48 an issue, or maybe even 50. But their revenues went up, subscribership went up, believe it or not, and I think they just secured their business model to a more sort of like stable cash flow on the back of that strategic decision. So it sounds like, exactly like you said, like print, the narrative, the print is dead, is actually probably a false narrative then, almost, in a way. It's declined for sure, but like we've talked about already in this conversation, there's niches, there's nuance, and there's room for to wriggle, so to speak.
Yeah, and we should be clear that the reason, I mean, I've said this many times over the years, the reason that people say print is dead is because the biggest bit of it is dead. The mass market, characterized by celebrity weeklies, women's weeklies, TV listings, magazines, which were enormous circulation drivers, and to a certain extent daily newspapers, enormous circulation drivers. Yeah, that probably is mostly dead or dying. But that's not the industry. That's only a fraction of the industry. And the bit of it that's not that is actually pretty robust and in many cases growing quite nicely, some of which is adopting the strategy that you've just described. People do value a luxury product. They do believe that something that's priced better and has better production values has more value to them as a reader, and that's borne out by the performance of magazines like the one you cited there.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Yeah. And so I kind of like that as a strategy generally, just to, because it's quite counterintuitive. But that it's a nice segue into, sorry.
I mean, you want to make every, a friend of mine who runs one of these magazines, you want to make every single issue of the magazine an event. Also something that people anticipate when they're waiting for it to drop through the door box, through the letterbox, that it should be, something that they're sitting there on tenterhooks waiting for, rather than just, God,
building anticipation.
Yeah. Oh God, another issue of the magazine's come through the door and I haven't finished reading the last one yet. There's definitely a sense in which if you make big, high quality, high production value magazines and do them less often, that's probably a better strategy.
Yeah, and people are probably more likely to hang on to them then as well. They won't get rid of them because it's kind of like a little centerpiece maybe for the coffee table or something nice because it's high value production. Yeah, that's really. Yeah, and so all of that kind of leads me to it's a nice little segue, because we talk a lot about like niches, and with now sort of a lot of these algorithms, this sort of age of hyper personalization of content, well, of everything, of content, of ads, of you name it, whatever you want, right? So it feels like that might amplify the silo effect, which we saw sort of, in 2016 with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and the documentary that came out about that, about our brains being hacked and the silo effect increasing, and that's causing all these other, terrible problems. So I guess, how do we square the circle of, hyper personalization to give the audience what they want and, cut the fluff and get rid of the noise, to, we're now all completely siloed and nobody has any shared reality, and now what?
It's an interesting debate, isn't it? Which came first, the hyper personalization, or let's say the partisanship of the media or partisanship of the audience, or is one merely reflecting the other? But which is reflecting which? I think you can't divorce these things from the general macroeconomic trend. And when I speak about this in public speaking things and conferences and so on, I do tie it back to the macroeconomic trend. The world has not recovered from the financial crisis. More than 15 years later, nearly 20 years later, we're still feeling the effects of that. We feel it in the form of a lack of real wage growth in many markets. We feel it in the form of inflation, driven by the subsequent kind of global socioeconomic turmoil that followed, and there's a bit of COVID in there as well, of course. So people who are less well off historically tend to rebel in whatever way that might be, and I think that's what you're seeing at the moment. So there's a sense in which, yes, the media is driving a lot of this, but the media is also only reflecting what people think. And people think that they're less well off, and they don't see any prospect of being better off. And I'm not a politician. I'm not going to dive into the ins and outs of whether that's correct or why and how you fix it. But that's certainly what people seem to be feeling. And in those circumstances, they flock to politicians, media outlets, pundits, whatever you want to call it, social media influencers, who pretend that they have an answer for it. When, of course, we know that the answer is a lot more complex than people think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess for publishers then, again, from publishers that I speak to anyway, certainly the dilemma for them from a business perspective is, how do I satisfy my audience for all the stuff that they need, but then not, I guess, bore them, maybe that's the wrong word, but give them enough flavor and diversity of voice and content, and enough novelty, but without being too novel that you alienate them or isolate them. I guess that's from the internal side. That's how I see the challenge. What do you think?
I mean, look, if you're a niche specialist interest publisher, you want your audience to be biased in favor of your niche. That's the whole point of it. What you want them to have a narrow focus and not much alternative attention, because that's how they stay with your niche. I think it's very hard these days for news publishers. Very difficult to find that ground, because you don't want to, good ones don't want to just be an echo chamber and a mirror reflecting their audiences. They want to present them with alternative viewpoints. But increasingly, that's difficult to do so. It's difficult because those alternative viewpoints don't want to engage with traditional media, but it's also difficult because the audience don't want to see that either. They're becoming a lot more polarized in the sense of it being, some of these issues being, in their minds, quite black and white. So I think it's a tough job being a news publisher at the moment and finding that middle ground. And the other danger, I think, at the moment is that you may make short-term decisions, and you've got to believe that this resurgence of right-wing populism is a short-term phenomenon. You may make short-term decisions that have long-term negative consequences, where you end up in a position in the market that actually becomes untenable in the long term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And sometimes it can be quite hard then to see the decision you've made in the short term, and to forecast any of those negative impacts that might be long. It's not like you're making a trade-off consciously in the moment. It's that you're maybe making a decision without having any sort of insight maybe about what impact that might have later on.
Yeah, and people's we know that people's political opinions change over time, and the cliche is that they get more right-wing as they get older. But to go back to what we started talking about in this conversation, the Washington Post, the danger for the Washington Post is that they so thoroughly alienate Gen Z that Gen Z never engage with them at any age in their life, much as, the example of the Sun and the people of Liverpool. People in Liverpool won't buy the Sun because of the way they covered the Hillsborough disaster, which was 40 years ago. So, you have to be very careful that what you're doing right now doesn't have a long-term impact on your business. And for the Post, it could be that they are satisfying the short-term gain of appeasing the prevailing political winds, but the long-term negative consequence is that younger people won't engage with the brand anymore.
Yeah, that does seem to be a tactic you see across the board, particularly in the States anyway these days, with a lot of companies, when it was one narrative, a little bit more liberal, they were all jumping on that bandwagon. Now it's a different narrative, a little bit less liberal and more sort of right wing. They're on that one. So, it's an interesting one. I don't know, but it seems to be a bit of a tightrope for publishers as well. So it can be obviously hard to what would you call it? Navigate the tightrope for a news publisher. What about somebody on the more niche end who are, I guess, less politicized topics, but still trying to avoid, becoming too narrow, I guess, in some ways, or, at risk of boring the audience maybe, but also at risk of alienating them?
The first thing to be conscious of as a publisher is that everything is political. There is a political dimension to every subject, even ones that we might think are, relatively benign. I saw a load of people on X having a go at meteorologists the other day, because they were convinced that they were falsifying temperature records and therefore climate change, blah, blah, blah. You can join the dots yourself. So, there isn't any, and I've, started looking at this and I was like, why on earth are they going after them? It's like, oh, okay, now I understand. So anything has a political dimension, and I think as a publisher you have to be aware of that. And the political dimension cuts both ways. It works both for Gen Z, which has its own positions on things, and, people who are on the right wing, who have their own political positions as well. So I think to pretend it's not happening would be a mistake. I think what you do need to do is accept that you can't please everybody. You're going to alienate some. In a polarized world, you are going to alienate some people. You've just got to make a judgment as to whether or not that alienation is justified, both socially, morally, and economically, and whether it's going to have any long-term detriment to your brand. And if the answer is, well, I can live with it, then live with it. But don't pretend it's impossible, because you cannot tell where the next flashpoint would be. And it might be a flashpoint that affects your brand, however niche it is.
That's good advice. So a bit of resilience goes a long way, it sounds like. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's right. Yeah, a bit of resilience, and just a bit of not trying to please everybody, because it's impossible. It always was impossible, but it's even more impossible now. A little bit of, resilience, holding your nerve, but also making sure that you're able to have a clear, logical justification for what you're doing, I think is really important.
Just very quickly before you head off is sort of the question around, copyright basically and IP these days. So it's all very well for us to talk about how publishers can make money and how journalists can make money and do all these kind of great things and new independent media and all that sort of stuff. But if you can't protect your IP, or it's at risk to the point where the market largely just sees it as devalued, or even the individuals creating it, like the journalists, see it as devalued, how, what can a publisher do? What can a journalist do?
Well, to take the last part of your question first, what can they do? This is the time to step up and be counted. This is the time to be an activist as a publisher. This is the time, and as somebody who worked in associations, I would say this, but I think it's true. This is the time to support your association and for collective action, because we do stand at a point where one of the fundamental underpinnings of the economy of our industry, which is copyright, is under threat. There's a substantial body of new technology businesses who would like to see copyright law abolished, not because they have any particular moral long-term view on it, but just because in the short term it hurts their business model. So I think it's really important that we don't allow this fundamental protection to disappear. Copyright is what underpins so much of the work that we do. it creates an enormous amount of value in this multi-million, hundreds of millions, I forget what this figure that was cited, creative industries that we have in the UK, and of course multi-billion-dollar industry across Europe. I think the other crucial point that's worth remembering, I was sat in a conference recently with two members of the European Commission, and the more senior of the two said, look, copyright law as it stands right now protects media businesses and content creators from the things that AI companies are doing. It's just that it's not being enforced properly. So, of course, we said, well, what are you doing to enforce it? And the answer there came none. But I think the law is there. The legal positions are clear. It's incumbent upon us to protect our legal position, to enforce our legal position in the absence of any governmental support for doing so. This is very frustrating because it's yet another example of government getting swayed by shiny toys and bending over for companies that actually aren't proposing to invest anything in the UK or in the EU, are largely based in the US, are not going to deliver any direct intrinsic value in terms of the value of those corporations back into the European Union or the UK. But nevertheless, because it's new and shiny, they feel they should be supportive. Now, the other, there are people who say, and people have said in comments on social, on my posts and things, oh, well, you're stifling innovation. We're not stifling innovation. We want innovation. I use AI just like everybody else. Every media business I know uses AI and wants to carry on doing so. They just want it to be on a proper legal and commercial footing and not be a kind of free-for-all where we yet again give away the value of our business for nothing because of some shiny new technology. I mean, it's just madness. I think the good news, and before I stop ranting on this, is that there is a significant amount of collaboration in the industry on this at the moment, almost unprecedented. It's really heartening to see. So whilst I'm saying that companies should be working together and all that kind of stuff, they are doing that, and they're doing a reasonably good job within the confines of it. Yet again, the stumbling block is government, both the UK government and the European, where things are just happening too slowly. And whilst they sit and cogitate and think about this kind of stuff, they'll wake up in 2 years' time and discover that 50% of the industry has vanished while they've been sat in a committee room deciding what to do. So, speed of action is essential because the AI companies are not going to stop.
Yes, that's sort of perfect time for shameless plug of Writer's Block. If you need your content protected, get in touch. I think the way you framed it there is really spot on, actually, because in a word, now again, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a word, it sounds like incentives, right? Because any system is only as good. I mean, you can predict the outcome of any system if you just understand deeply what the incentives are, right? What the actual incentives are. And so, it seems at the moment with all this IP and copyright breaches and infringements and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't seem like there's much incentive for any of the offenders to stop, as you say, because the enforcement isn't being put in place, even though the laws actually do exist, which I love that you're bringing that up. This is one of the things that we've seen as well, Writer's Block, which I think is really interesting that people have just forgotten is the laws exist. It's just, yes, they need to have an incentive to enforce them. But we've seen this before, right? I mean, look at the music industry in the 80s and the 90s. What do they call it? The record labels thought they were in some seriously hot water. And, a few technical innovations and a couple of different companies between, say, like iTunes and later Spotify did exactly as you say. It gave them a very stable footing for a commercial and legal framework to operate. And after that, it was the way you go. And another actually more recent example is on the same sort of token is Roblox, who had a similar, they were the gaming platform, right? You may be familiar with the case where they had essentially all the kids were using copyrighted music to create games on their platform, which was totally illegal. Roblox got sued. And then instead, the case was settled just by Roblox signing these commercial agreements with all the record labels. And away you go, you can use the music and there you have it. So I think, there's hope for us yet.
It took 20 years for the law and the enforcement to catch up with Google in copyright. If it takes the same with AI, by the time they get around to it, we'll all be out of business. So there's something needs to happen. And I think something is happening, which is good. But It is a genuinely transformative technology. It's a good, it's a good thing to be adopting. It's a useful thing. You can't also divorce any of these things always from the macro view. Why are European governments so enthusiastic about this? It's because there's a crisis of productivity in European markets, and there has been for 30, 40 years. We are not as productive as other economies, and our productivity is not growing as quickly as other economies. And so AI is seen as a means to improve, to correct what is a long-term trend. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but anyway, that's one of the reasons that it's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it, right? Because I don't want to keep you too long, but also we want to end on a positive, right? There's hope for us all just yet. We just need to sort of bit of diligence and
hold the line. Hold the line. Hopefully we'll be okay.
Absolutely. So before we go, where can people find you? Like, what are you up to at the moment? We didn't really dive too much into you. Sorry, that's my fault. But there's just so much going on, right? But where can people find you? What are you up to?
So I run my own consulting business. We do consulting for media businesses on all sorts of stuff. You can find us at www.sohoconsult.co.uk. That's SOHOCONSULT. Or you can reach me, James, at sohoconsult.co.uk. And I'd love to talk to you about what's going on in your business.
Amazing. Perfect. Well, I think, James, that's a lovely place to end it there. Thank you so much for coming on. And hopefully the first of multiple conversations.
Love to. Thanks, John.